O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And in this video, I am going to sort of recap and summarize my latest stream, a sponsored stream. Major thank you to Orthodox Centurion on Freemasonry and the Revolutionary Spirit. I got off the stream last night and something just didn't sit right with me. And I think what it was is there was so much information. The topic that Orthodox Centurion asked me to look into was the Masonic relationship to revolutions, particularly the American, the French, and the Bolshevik, the Russian Revolution, most specifically in 1917. And so doing all that research led me down many different pathways, some of which I was not very familiar with. And therefore, I was kind of inundated with so much information when I got off the stream last night and we were reading James Billington's prominent work, Fire in the Minds of Men. I thought, I didn't do the job I wanted to in sort of syncretizing and summarizing the entire sort of argument that I wanted to make. And so that's what this video is for, is to sort of connect the dots. And so in regards to Masonry, one of the things I was trying to highlight in that stream, and you guys can go back and you can look more into it. So I'm going to go through and show you all the sources or all the pieces of information that I use, basically tie a thread through a series of beads. And you guys then, if you're interested in that, you can do your own research, or you can look a little bit into the longer stream that was like 3.5 hours long. So to begin with, the argument was that Masonry is not actually a monolithic thing, as some people may speculate. Certainly, it's not consistent with an Orthodox fronema, because as one of the articles I showed, and I'm going to demonstrate today, just highlight, you guys can read more of it, is that it is claims to be, and the Orthodox Church believes it to be, a continuation of some of the ancient mystery traditions, even coming from Eleusis, so the Eleusinian mysteries, and many people may be familiar with the Kakekion and potential use of inebriating substances. And I've wrote about this and done streams on this topic. But Masonry is, in its influence, was different in the American context than in the French context. And so what I thought was most interesting, and what I really tried to develop within the stream and the research that I was trying to uncover and explicate, is that French Masonry, interestingly enough, has a very unique connection with socialist and communist movements. And so that was one of the things I wanted to differentiate, because when you look at Masonry in the Protestant context, and mostly the Scandinavians, Britain, and America, we didn't see that same revolutionary spirit described in the 19th century during all that turmoil in Europe. And so some people have speculated, and this is something that maybe you guys can speculate on. There might be multiple reasons why that is. Some believe that maybe Protestantism and this idea of, as we've argued as Orthodox, the sort of relativism that everybody can have sort of differing opinions about scripture, interpretation, hermeneutics, exegesis, that sort of plays into living in a society that's more multivariant in regards to people's personal opinions, and that the federalistic structure of the American Revolution itself and creating the sort of Federalist Republic structure diffused the centralization of power. Now, as I highlighted in the stream, obviously this is falling apart, and here in the United States, much of what was unique and prominent, like again, having private property, which I'm going to highlight, is actually biblical. And when we look at the French Revolution, whether it be Rousseau, whether it be many of these other occultists and Masons, the idea was that private property was actually the problem, and ties into contemporary rhetoric coming out of the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset. And so my point was to highlight that, interestingly enough, I think this particular strand of ideology that comes from the French Revolution through certain Masonic lodges. Some Masons may claim that some of these French lodges are clandestine, that they're sort of separate. And there are many internal factions with Masonry, so it's not all one explicit thing, but that the influence in the revolution were different in subtle ways. So I just want to then present some of this stuff to you guys real quick to just encapsulate what it is I was trying to show last night. So we were reading again from the book Fire in the Minds of Men. And again, as I go through here, just look at some of the URLs. If you want to go back and do some of your own research, feel free to. That was really the point of this video. And so files.libcom.org has a great copy of this book, in which then you can do command find, and you can do various word searches for particular concepts, words, people, like whatever you're kind of looking for. So that's why I think it's really beneficial to have this one as opposed to sites like archive.org, where it's a little bit harder to do with these word searches. But we were talking about Fire in the Minds of Men as highlighting the origins of the revolutionary faith. And what was I utilize this book for is that there's a whole section on the occult origins of organization. You can see that right here. And what James Billington makes the claim is that Freemasonry and German Illuminism, coming from Adam Weishaupt. Some of you guys may be familiar with, again, the origins of the Illuminati, stuff like that, that these particular Illuminist strands believe that man was going to essentially deify himself without God. And I read that in that last stream. And that's what James Billington was trying to highlight, is that the sort of German Illuministic ideas, occultism, which is, again, is influenced by, and we're going to just mention quickly as we go through this, things like, again, the most magical century of Europe, the 16th century, the 1500s, where we see alchemy, we see people like Paracelsus and Jacob Burma, John Dee, and even Frederick the Elector Palatine in the what's referred to as the Winter King, his marriage to Elizabeth, and trying to reconstruct a sort of magical Protestant empire in Bohemia after Rudolph II. And so this was a syncretic process of like infusing Protestantism with aspects of Kabbalah, aspects of, again, esoteric spirituality, ritualistic magic, this type of thing. Of course, that fails and ends up in essentially ending in the 30 Years' War. But that gave rise to the Illuminist strands. And if you guys have read Frances Yates' book on Rosicrucianism, she highlights and lays out why Germany is so important in the facilitation of many of these esoteric and occult ideas. So Billington makes that same claim. And so when we trace this revolutionary faith, it's not all of Masonry, although as an Orthodox Christian, we would say that Masonry is indicative of the Enlightenment ideals: liberty, fraternity, equality. And there's then splits on which one's emphasized more. Is it liberty or is it equality? And you could make a case that some of the more Protestant variations, like America, like Britain, is maybe in favor of aspects of liberty, but the equality strand is certainly going to be part and parcel of the socialist and communist rhetoric that's going to eventually come to fruition, I would argue, in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And that when we look at the World Economic Forum and they're advocating for, again, minority rights, not that we're against all people being made in the image of God, but doing away with private property, a radical transition and reconstruction of the world, new economic systems that are more equal and fair, that capitalistic pursuits for private property and private ownership, that this is detrimental now to the environment. So the general rhetoric, the general narrative that we see coming out of the globalist elites that we're aware of, and the fact that we're well on our way to the Great Reset, that is expected to end in 2030, that this particular strand, looking at French Masonry, looking at the communist socialist ideals, looking at occult spirituality of basically man deifying himself without the need of God, and the influence of Jewish Kabbalah, I think it's very interesting because it seems like that maybe is the undergirding strand of maybe some of the utopian worldly rhetoric we're hearing from the globalist sector. So, this was the book that we were talking about. Again, check this out if you're interested. And so this is James Billington, who wrote the book. He was the 13th Librarian of Congress. It's a very well-read book. Again, I don't know exactly what James Billington's personal religious or spiritual beliefs were. But I do recommend this book, and going through it, it's very well researched, and it presents some very unique information that is often not explicated on in various historians' works. So that is James Billington. Again, in regards to Freemasonry and Orthodoxy, I was reading from this article, Freemasonry, the official statement of the Church of Greece in 1933. Now, it's interesting enough because we're going to highlight that Freemasonry and somebody like Alexander Pushkin, the Russian poet and romanticist, that he himself finds eventually leaves Russia for the Caucasus region and eventually winds up fighting in favor of the Greek Revolution and finding independence from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, he was explicitly a Freemason who got initiated during this period in history. So is Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire good? Yeah, I would say so. Does that mean I'm in favor of, again, some of the revolutionary inklings or the Enlightenment ideals of Masonry? Absolutely not. So this was the official statement that I read through in that stream. And if you want to read more about it, you can do so. But basically, it highlights that Masonry, in its own words, claims to be a sort of syncretic religious tradition that finds its origins all the way back to Eleusis and the ancient mystery traditions of old, and that Gnosticism and this pursuit for rational knowledge is something that both Masonry is a part of, a sort of illuministic framework. You could call it Luciferian. Certainly the sort of worship of the sun or of the light, of a general God architect, but at the same time, it's explicitly not Christian. Sometimes they're explicitly anti-Christian. And we have an article from Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, in which she then sort of congratulates Masonry on its attack of the papacy. And that's part why the Masonic traditions are very different in the Protestant context versus this French context, because of its rivalry with the Catholic papacy. Now, again, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm certainly not in favor of the Catholic papacy, but I think this is a very interesting historical angle. And this is why some of these French lodges are so conducive to socialism and communism, of which I found an article on a Marxist website. And they them are lamenting the fact that so many French Masons are part of the communist movement, if you will, in France. So just connecting that itself. So Orthodoxy is explicitly not in favor of Freemasonry in any way, and you can read that there. Now, and in regards to the American context, most people are going to be much more familiar with Masonic involvement in the Revolution. As I highlighted, the exact number of Masons, it's hard to pinpoint. Some have speculated. According to the one Masonic site that I use, this one right here, it argues that only 8 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were actually Masons. Now, it also highlights that Paul Revere himself was part of the Masonic lodges at that time. I saw other articles that were claiming somewhere in the range of potentially up to 14 signers of the Declaration of Independence may have had some relationship to the Masonic lodges. Hard to pinpoint, but we certainly know that George Washington and many of the founding fathers did have Masonic connections. Certainly Ben Franklin, and he was into some very strange things, especially his time in France. And so France comes up again because it's some of the French lodges that he was even initiated into as well. Now, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, he is the person who lays out the design for Washington, D.C., and we discussed this a little bit in the larger stream. He also inspired the street plan for Detroit, Michigan. He himself was a Mason who was hired by George Washington to sort of construct the layout of Washington, D.C. So just highlighting that, because obviously we know that the Masons had great influence in the American Revolution. We talked about how the lodges were homes for some of the militia movements and that they would have meetings there and stuff like that, the Sons of Liberty. But also we would know about money. So if you haven't looked into it, check out Jekyll Island, check out how the Federal Reserve came about, but certainly some of the U.S. Fiat notes, as they're referred to, has a lot of occult symbolism that we see the all-seeing eye over the pyramid, which again, Billington highlights, comes out of a synthesis of occult ideals and spirituality coming from German Illuminism, as well as Masonry itself. And I've talked before about the Masonic connection to the Knights Templars, in which the Knights Templars, the sort of knights during the Crusades, it seems to me, got initiated in various forms of Gnostic spirituality, again, a sort of existential pursuit of spiritual knowledge. And that when the Inquisition happened and their leader was killed, eventually they move up to Scotland, and Robert the Bruce, he himself sort of brings them in and gives some of the Templars land, which eventually comes is referred to as Rosalind's Chapel. There has a lot of Masonic and Templar symbolism. So my point is, certainly the U.S. had much Masonic influences, although the Protestant context and the Federalist structure certainly diffused the centralization of power as compared to the French Revolution. So you can look at the money. You can look at, as I argued, the full fulfillment of maybe some of these ideals, these Masonic occult connections. At this point, it seems like the federal government and the Federalist structure is sorely eroded, and that we exist in a two-party system which are working for the same people, which connect to the end of our narrative here, in which Leon Trotsky, who's one of the second in command in regards to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, his ideas and his followers actually are the progenitors to the neoconservative party in America. And so when we talk about the Republicans being Democrats 10 years behind, well, that seems to be the exact plan from the get-go, and that our conservative party, the neoconservative movement, has basically been constructed to sort of be a governor to the radical left, and that the radical left continues to push in one direction. And then we have an oppositional dialectic party. And this ties into, as Billington highlights, the utilization of Hegel's dialectics, and how many of these communist revolutionaries, obviously Marx is a materialist dialectic, building out of, again, the young Hegelians, the left-wing Hegelians following Hegel's work. Hegel believed history ends in the world historical figure of Napoleon, but his followers, they believe, no, the job wasn't done, and that a sort of worldly utopian state is the ultimate end goal. And so we can see a sort of false dialectic, a Hegelian dialectic here in the American context. And this is one of the reasons why, again, nothing gets done, and our country is basically falling apart. Anyways, I digress. So I also talked a little bit about the layout, again, of L'Enfant in here in Washington, D.C. And I played these videos, which I'm not going to play. You can look them up. The Pentagram in Washington, D.C., 1 and 2. And, I'm skeptical. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like some of the History Channel stuff. But what's interesting is the video does make an interesting connection between the broken pentagram, which you see here, to like Goethe's Faust, to black magic, to being a sort of portal potentially for spirits or whatnot. Again, take that for what you will. And this video then connects it with the planetary movements of Venus and highlights maybe some symbolic connections to Venus in Washington, D.C. Anyways, I'll just leave that for you guys to check out if you want. And so this article here we talked about was, the revolutionary Masons. In this article touches on George Washington and the amount of Freemasonry influence in regards to the American Revolution. And this article here is also about Freemasonry influence on the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. You can check that out if you want as well. But what was more interesting and what I wanted to highlight was the French Revolution. And so here is one of the French timelines. If you're not familiar with the French Revolution, you can check this out and see sort of how it unfolds. And of course, in all these revolutions that we see in the 19th century European context, including the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and many of these, the failed German Revolution, the Polish-Russian War, it has to do with many of the peasantry and the lower class people being short on bread, being short on economic activity. And so, again, this general rhetoric about how these, interestingly, mostly elites, mostly wealthy people are going to come and salvage sort of these peasants and give them economic opportunities because the capitalists and the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy have limited it. And so that obviously is going to coincide with socialist communist movements. And so the French Revolution was no different. King Louis, Marie Antoinette, they were living this very luxurious life in Versailles. Meanwhile, the capital of France was in Paris. And meanwhile, people weren't even getting bread. So this ferment, so the absence of food, the absence of resources for people fuels again this rhetoric. And that's where Billington highlights that the journalist and the intellectual becomes the progenitors of this revolutionary spirit, because it's really, as Dostoevsky highlights in his book The Possessed, it's really the fire is the intellectual ideas and the hope that's given to people who are in sort of distressed situations. So that's also going to be true, and one of the reasons why, obviously I'm in favor of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, but one of the things he was facing is that the workers of Russia and some of the feudal structures, were certainly disenfranchising some people, and then the sort of socialist communist rhetoric was giving them hope to some degree. So here's a timeline. You can check that out. This is a timeline of Napoleon, because Napoleon, interestingly enough, he himself was in fact a Mason. That's also a historical fact. Here's an article on that from a Freemasonic Lodge, if you want to look at that. Napoleon, the Freemason Emperor. And Napoleon, even though the French Revolution happens, the point is to undercut monarchy. We first have the cult of reason, then we have the cult of the supreme being replacing it. We have people like Rousseau, Robespierre, but then by the time of Napoleon, he sort of puts himself as in a way, an emperor, even though that was the point of the French Revolution. And so, interestingly enough, there were, even though he was a Mason, according to Billington, some of these French lodges were facilitating the socialist and communist rhetoric because they themselves weren't too happy with aspects of Napoleon's rise. So this article here was highlighting that this is one of the differences between the American and the French Revolution. One, the American Revolution was not as bloody, but because of the Protestantism and because the fact that the American Revolution was responding against the taxation, again, without representation, if you will, from the British Empire. We have the Boston Tea Party, all this different stuff. That's a little bit different than the ways in which we saw the French Revolution unfold. And so this just highlights that when you compare and contrast the American and the French Revolution, there's certainly major differences, although you can find also multiple similarities. So just highlighting that as well. And then I wanted to highlight, before we started getting into all these French revolutionaries that I mentioned throughout the last stream, and I feel like I didn't do a good job tying this thread together through all these different sources, is that many of them are all in favor of doing away with private property, because private property is believed to be one of the reasons for the societal ills and the disenfranchisement of certain people. Well, with that believed to be the case, I just wanted to highlight that property law and private property is a biblical idea, and highlighting that this Masonic, Illuministic, Kabbalistic, atheistic, communist, socialist infusion, the sort of syncretic blending of all these things together, that it's always has to do with doing away with private property. And we see the same thing with the World Economic Forum. So I just wanted to highlight that private property itself is biblical. And then, of course, there's the Napoleon thing. Now, here's some of the movers and shakers that I wanted to, I was referring to last night, but trying to give you a better framework for the general narrative, the historical narrative through the 19th century, is we have somebody like Rousseau, whose ideas were incredibly influential. And of course, he was a Genevan. And Geneva in Switzerland, along with Zurich, is going to be a place that's going to be a hotspot for many of the French lodges, for the communist socialist rhetoric. Lenin himself, as we'll see, spent a considerable amount of time in Geneva before going back to Russia when the Bolshevik Revolution happens. And along with some of these other revolutionaries like Buonarroti, who this Felipe, he was a descendant of Michelangelo. He had the same surname, but he also was an Italian utopian socialist writer, agitator, Freemason, and conspirator. He was active in Corsica, France, and Geneva. So Geneva is one of these places. France and Geneva, Switzerland keep coming up, even though Switzerland itself was not a hotspot of revolution. It was a hotspot for revolutionary organization due to some of these secret meetings and whatnot. So he became a quintessential. He wrote this book, The History of Babeff's Conspiracy of Equals. And we'll see that, again, the conspiracy of equals was to make complete equality, the amount of money you made, the amount of things you own, that it was equal across the board. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. But Rousseau himself, again, was against, argues that private property is the source of inequality. And one of the things I do agree with him is he highlights that the decadence found in cities, urban cities, was led to a moral degradation. I would agree with him there. And this is true really worldwide. You see more conservative values in rural people than you see in urban people. But Bonratti, he features often in the Billington work, and so he's talking about Babeuf here, and he was a French proto-communist revolutionary journalist of the French Revolutionary period. Um, he led a popular revolt against the Directory, the French Directory, the government of France. He was leading advocate for democracy and the abolition of private property. He angered the authorities who were clamping down hard on their radical enemies. And in spite of the efforts of the Jacobins' friends to save him, Babeuf was executed for his role in the conspiracy of equals. And so then you can go look into the conspiracy of equals. Again, I talked a little bit about this last night and read about this, but you guys can look into it yourself. And so you see that Napoleon was not very much in favor of that and closed the club of the Pantheon in 1786. Babeuf increased his activities and yada. Well, eventually he's killed by the guillotine, which is a commonality when we look at the French Revolution. And so this was Bonratti. Again, this gentleman right here, he's as Billington argues, a sort of cornerstone for this particular revolutionary spirit and a historical figure that most people haven't touched on. And we can see that he was certainly a Mason, and he joined the Masonic Lodge in 1786. And so he joined the Jacobin Club and became friends with the Bonapartists and all types of stuff. So, okay, we get that. Moving forward here, this was the book that he wrote, The History of Babeuf's Conspiracy for Equality. The Conspiracy of Equals, again, was a failed coup d'etat during the French Revolution, and it led Francis Noel Babeuf, who wanted to overthrow the Directory and place it with an egalitarian proto-socialist republic inspired by the Jacobin ideals. And so this was also, again, about, here it is, we aspire to live and die equal. The way we were born, we want equality of death is what we need, and we'll have real equality at whatever cost. However, the conspiracy failed to include colonial slaves. But again, we see the abolition of private property, and at some points even wanting to do away with the incentives for work and what separates people financially, all that type of stuff. Okay. Now we see Blanqui was another figure, and he was a French socialist and political activist, notable for his revolutionary theory. And he himself, again, Blanqui inspired an uprising which took place in Paris, in which the League of the Just, forerunners of Karl Marx's Communist League, participated. And so, interestingly enough, again, he was interested in the redistribution of wealth. Again, many of these socialist ideas, various ways from our socialist currents of today. On one side, contrary to Karl Marx, Blanqui did not believe in the preponderant role of the working class, nor in popular movements. He thought, on the contrary, that the revolution should be carried out by a small group who would establish the contemporary dictatorship by force. And so, yeah, anyways, you get it. You get it there. So wanted to highlight that. Moving forward, we have the Cult of Reason, and it's eventually its rival, the Cult of the Supreme Being. This is because I wanted to highlight that these movements, again, one of the differences that Billington highlights is that within the Protestant context, God was not so much usurped. Now, certainly we would talk about the founding fathers of the American situation being deist. I mean, how much would they be biblical Christians? We know that Thomas Jefferson was a red letter Christian, meaning he only basically read the words of Jesus and threw everything else out. Interesting argument there. Certainly, as Orthodox, we would question their fidelity to the Christian faith. But unlike the French Revolution, it was not about the total overthrowing of God. And so the Cult of Reason eventually gets replaced with the Cult of the Supreme Being here. And so I just wanted to highlight this is sort of a deistic reinterpretation by Maximilien Robespierre. Okay, moving forward, we see Nicholas Bonneville. Now, he's an interesting figure because we'll see that Bonneville actually has a sort of menage a trois relationship with Thomas Paine, one of the, again, considered a patriots within the American Revolution. Now, Thomas Paine, as we'll highlight, has an interesting book on the origin of Freemasonry, which Bonneville himself helped him publish. And he spent a significant time in France and was having a sort of polyamorous relationship with Bonneville's wife, who then accompanied him back to America afterwards. But he was a French bookseller, printer, journalist, and writer. He was also a political figure of some relevance at the time of the French Revolution into the early years. He was certainly initiated into Freemasonry in 1786 during his stay in England. He wrote the book on the subjects, Jesuits Expelled from Masonry, Dagger of the Shattered, in which he accuses Jesuits having introduced into symbolic degrees of Freemasonry the myths of the Templars and their doctrine of revenge based on the crime of their destruction. And the four vows of the Templars included the four higher degrees earlier. In 1787, the leading Bavarian Illuminist and Freemason, Christoph Bode, is said to have converted to the German-speaking Bonneville to a faith of combined esoteric symbolism and radical ideas on popular sovereignty bordering on direct democracy. Okay, so just wanted to highlight that. Again, you guys can look more into it. Of course, we have Maximilien Robespierre, controversial figure, played a pivotal role in the events that led to the downfall of the French monarchy, and was another upholder of direct democracy, had certainly some socialist ideals. And so just wanted to, obviously, is an important figure. You guys can look more into it. The Jacobins, or simply was an influential political club during the French Revolution in 1789. The period of its political ascendancy includes the Reign of Terror, in which, again, 10,000 people were executed. And yeah, so popular enough. You guys get it. You can look into it. Theodore Dezamy was a French socialist, representative of the neo-Babavist tendency in early French communism, along with, again, various individuals. He was also an associate of Blanqui, and his colleagues formed a link between the extremes left of the French Revolution and Marxism. So, again, wanted to highlight that as well for you guys. And the reason why, I get Wikipedia is a CIA front. You got to be skeptical on manipulated information. But one of the good parts, and what you can use Wikipedia for, is to come down here and find some of the sources that cite the information. And that's why I use it. Obviously, I'm very skeptical of anything on Wikipedia, but as a researcher, you can go here and try to find sources and get back to whatever's being cited. Pyotr Takachev was a Russian writer, critic, and revolutionary theorist who formulated many of the revolutionary principles that were later developed and put into action by Vladimir Lenin. Although Takachev is sometimes described as the first Bolshevik, he did not figure prominently in the mythology of the Soviet Union. So, wanted just to highlight him because he's another figure that some people hadn't heard of that plays into our sort of general narrative here. And down here, it talks about his political career. Again, you guys can read all this. My goal is not to read these articles, but just to lay out, again, how it all connects. We have Proudhon, which was a sort of rival to Karl Marx. He is the father of anarchy. He was a French socialist, politician, philosopher, and economist who founded mutualist philosophy and considered in many ways the father of anarchism. And he was the first person to declare himself an anarchist. Now, he eventually had some falling out with Karl Marx, and it could be because of friendships due to certain people or whatnot. So just wanted to highlight that as well for you guys and connect that together. Karl Marx, interestingly enough, he has a considerable amount of time over in France as well. Again, he has a whole section here in Paris, Brussels, but you're going to be familiar with Das Kapital, the Communist Manifesto, all that different stuff, the works of Karl Marx. But my point, obviously, him being German, and him being an atheist and him being Jewish and a young Hegelian all sort of fit together in this general narrative. Adam Weishaupt, again, Billington highlights that German Illuminism was an important catalyst for these sort of revolutionary sentiments that sort of take over continental Europe in the 19th century. He was a German philosopher, professor in civil law, and later canon law, and a founder of the Illuminati. So You guys know, you can look into this. So just wanted to highlight that general sentiment. And I've done other streams talking about how these esoteric spiritualities really get going. And that when we look at like the book of the Zohar, which is the sort of magical text of Judaism that really deals with the Kabbalah, that we can point back to the Iberian Peninsula in Spain when Jews, Christian, and Muslims were allowed to sort of investigate and share ideas in regards to mysticism, magic, and whatnot. And we'll see somebody like Giovanni Piccadella Mirandola, who develops what is called Christian Kabbalah, as also being part of this sort of continuative project. And so I just wanted to highlight that Kabbalah is certainly part of it's included in Western esotericism. We have Christian Kabbalah, Hermetic Kabbalah, but when we look at the Poland, for example, and some of those revolutions, we see a real Jewish influence. And I just wanted to highlight that, again, this revolutionary faith certainly infuses many of these magical ideas. And that's how, as an Orthodox Christian, I would argue that they're all connected, because it all is part and parcel of these illuministic, esoteric, obviously, I would argue, magical, satanic projects, if you will. So I also wanted to highlight, again, a gentleman that I mentioned briefly, but we've talked about before, is Frederick the Elector Palatine. Why is Illuminism getting going in the German context? When we look at Adam Weishaupt, we're looking at 1748 to November 1830. Well, before that, we can point to somebody like Frederick the Elector Palatine when the Holy Roman Empire was in existence, and the Emperor Rudolph II, who was very, very much interested in the magical arts. And that's why we see somebody like John Dee and Edward Kelly being brought to the Holy Roman Empire and to the court of Rudolph II for their alchemical promises to transmutate lead into gold. Well, Rudolph had the very strange court, and so when we see these sort of archetypes of a royal king with like dwarfs and naked women and the sort of Joker figure, a sort of a circus-like feel. This was the court of Rudolph II. And so I wanted to highlight that after Rudolph eventually comes to the ascendancy of the Winter King, Frederick the Elector Palatine marries Elizabeth from the British Empire. And this was an attempt to form he was the King of Bohemia, and that the Holy Roman Empire was obviously historically Catholic. Rudolph II is part of the Habsburg lineage, but his influence and his very much love for the magical arts also made Prague in the Kingdom of Bohemia being a hotspot for Jews that would bring things like Kabbalah and whatnot. So Frederick the Elector Palatine, he himself was very much interested in these magical arts. And so as the Winter King, this was an attempt, and leads into the loss on the Battle of White Mountain, that the 30 Years' War comes to place, because the Catholic Church is obviously not happy with the fact that there's an attempt to overthrow the Holy Roman Empire by a synthesis of these sort of Protestant, magical, Kabbalistic yearnings. And Frederick the Elector Palatine was certainly part of that, him and his wife, Elizabeth. So I only highlight that because this sets the stage for why Adam Weishaupt and German Illuminist spirituality really gets going there. So just highlighting that. Again, here's Rudolph II, very strange guy, had some strange, he's often described as incredibly erotic, or here you go. He was unusually erotic. Again, very strange guy, very much interested in the occult. Again, he was part of the House of Habsburg. So, Kingdom of Bohemia, I just wanted to highlight that, again, under Rudolph, many people who were practicing the Kabbalistic arts were, again, in this general area. And then we see somebody like Alexander Pushkin, again, during that 19th century period. He was a Romantic era playwright, poet, novelist, and that despite being Russian and of Russian nobility, his first language is French, interestingly enough, and that he really doesn't start getting into Russian until really his teenage years. But my point with him is that he was also a Mason, and he joined again. So he eventually leaves Russia, where he went to the Caucasus area and Crimea. And there he became a Freemason, and he participated, interestingly enough, in the Filiki Etheria revolution, which is the German or the Greek revolution to overthrow the Ottoman Empire in Greece. And so just connecting that again with all these revolutionary movements during the 19th century, that somebody like Pushkin, we can see a esoteric, we can see a Masonic connection there. So just highlighting that. Of course, we have Vladimir Lenin, and he was a Jewish man who is sort of the founder of the Bolshevik movement, and he becomes head of command after the 1917 revolution and the overthrowing of the Russian Tsar. So another group that we highlighted yesterday was the Cabinari, which is a sort of secret revolutionary societies that come out of Italy and participated in many revolutionary groups, including France, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, Uruguay, and Russia. And so I just wanted to highlight that this was another group. And if you're not familiar, you guys can dive more into it if you will. So this was another gentleman, again, an important figure that sort of, again, Billington highlights, not often mentioned, is Stefan Radchenko. And he is part of the Institute of Technology, which is a hot spot for the student unions and sort of the student fever for socialist, communist ideology there in St. Petersburg, Russia. And certainly Lenin and many of his compatriots were in conjunction with that Institute of Technology. But this gentleman right here is of interest. And so if you want to dive more into it, you can. Now, I had this article here, and I didn't do a great job explaining why it was important. And this comes from, again, a Marxist.org website. And what it highlights is that this is from Leon Trotsky. So this is describing French Masonry and its connection to communism. And so you can read this article and check it out. It goes into great detail, but we'll just leave it here with the last line. It says, Freemasonry is an ulcer on the body of French communism. The ulcer ought to be cauterized. And so it highlights, again, these socialist communist sentiments, which aren't indicative of all Masonry, especially in the Protestant context. They tend to be very anti-communist, but in the French context, due to the French Revolution, due to this insistent belief on the eradication of private property and workers' rights and the redistribution of wealth and all these different ideas, that we see communism in the French context actually infiltrate many of the Masonic lodges. And some Masons, I'm not a Mason, I've never been a Mason, but I'm certainly, some Masons would argue that some of these Grand Orient lodges in France are probably clandestine or broke off or not in complete union with the other aspects of the Masonic Brotherhood, if you will. But anyways, this is an interesting article, and this comes from Marxist.org. You can check that out. This was one of the few articles I found to try to connect a Masonic connection to Lenin or Trotsky, because when the Bolsheviks come into power in Russia, one of the first things they do, like Hitler, is they shut down the Masonic lodges. So many people speculate, well, then the communists and the Bolsheviks, they had no Masonic lineage. Maybe so. And this is a random article, blog thing that I found on online. So I don't know how to, again, know how valid its arguments are. But one of the interesting things that I found is that the connection of Lenin and Trotsky to Freemasonry all come back to these French lodges. And so it talks about how German philosopher Karl Marx has formulated his ideological foundation for the Soviet Union writings. His real name was Chaim Mordecai Herschel, and that he was a member of one of these French lodges, meaning his father. So interesting. I wouldn't be surprised there. This claims that Vladimir Lenin was a lodge brother, and that, again, it comes back to this Art et Travail French lodge and the Nine Sisters of the Union of de Belleville, two lodges belonging to the Grand Orient of France. Now, again, I found some sources to say that the Grand Orient Masonic lodges of France are clandestine. They're not in total union with the other Masonic lodges. That might be true. But interestingly enough, this comes from Winston Churchill, and Trotsky also belonged to these same French lodges. And so, interestingly enough, there could be a Masonic connection, even with Trotsky and Lenin being somewhat initiated into the Brotherhood. This one claims that Lenin was a 31st degree. Again, take this with what you will. I don't know how accurate these sites are, but again, just in my research, I thought it was interesting. So moving forward, again, we have the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution, we have, again, the Greek Revolution, Filiki Eteria, and we see here that there were obvious Masonic connections. And again, the three Greeks came together in 1814 in Odessa to decide the constitution of a secret organization in Freemasonic fashion. Down here, it talks about Carbonarism. And remember, that was this group right here. And so it's highlighting that various members were initiated in the Freemasonic Lodge and whatnot. So we know that Pushkin was a Mason. We know that him as a Mason ends up fighting in favor of this revolution here. And am I in favor of the Greeks having independence from the Ottomans? Yes. But I just thought that was an interesting connection for the sort of general historical narrative here. Then we have places like the November Uprising, which is a Poland-Russian war. And according to Billington, this is a point in which we see, again, student unions, younger people of Polish identity, sort of gaining an alliance with many Jews at the time to sort of overthrow the Russian occupation or the Russian dominance of Poland at that time. Eventually, it's failed. So this is a failed revolution. But again, just highlighting all these revolutions in the 19th century, I thought it was worth highlighting. Obviously, here's the revolutions of 1848, and there's a whole bunch. We see it all over Europe. The Italian states, France, German states, Denmark, the Habsburg monarchy, Hungary, Galicia, Sweden, Switzerland, Greater Poland, Romanian principalities, Belgium, United Kingdom and Ireland, Spain, and other European states. So again, much revolutionary fever during the 19th century that I was trying to highlight. Here's the Russian Revolution you guys are going to be most familiar with. And then we have the February Revolution. This is, again, really when the Bolsheviks take full power in 1917. The revolutions during the 1820s, again, we see them all over Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Russia, Argentina. And so the same thing, again, and it was the same in Greece that the wars to overthrow the Ottoman Empire, which we've already highlighted. And so here's the Decembrist Revolt. This was another sort of revolutionary attempt, if you will, in Russia in the December of 1825. So between 1820 and 1848, my point is just to highlight how many of these uprisings there were. This is one of the failed revolutions after World War I, the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919. This leads to the establishment of the Weimar Republic, and the revolutionary period lasted from 1918 until the adoption. And so this was also the revolutionaries inspired by communist and social ideas did not hand over power to Soviet-style councils as the Bolsheviks had done in Russia because the leadership of the Socialist Democratic Party of Germany opposed their creation. So again, we see the same socialist, communist intentions and ideals in regards to this failed revolution. Saint Simon and the Saint Simonians, again, were highlighted in the Billington work in that he was a French political and economic and social theorist and businessman who's thought a substantial influence on politics, sociology, and the philosophy of science. And so just wanted to highlight that. The Young Hegelians, this is where Marx comes out of. If you're not familiar, check it out. This is the article by Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, in which she praises Masonry and its attempt to overthrow the papacy. And so you'll see here where she talks about how Freemasonry will have the glory of subduing the terrible hydra of the papacy, planting on its ruins the secular standard, verita, amore, truth and love. In it, again, she, interestingly enough, she claims to disarm the church is not to kill her. We must decapitate her in Rome. And in here, it is thou, O Satan, who inspireth my verse. If I breaketh forth from my breast, defying the God of the Pontiff Kings. Oh, hail, O Satan, thou hast conquered the Jehovah of the priest. So my only point in using this, it was to reference the theosophical connection, this esoteric spirituality, and how somebody like Blavatsky and Theosophy saw Freemasonry as, again, in opposition to Catholicism, which characterizes that French revolutionary spirit. This is the article by Tom, or a book by Thomas Paine, actually helped published by Bonneville, the other man who Bonneville was sharing his wife with Thomas Paine. And he has and it's debated. I was trying to find, is Thomas Paine a Mason? Found multiple different sources. Some argued he was, many argued that he wasn't. Hard to point, but he wrote a book on the origin of Freemasonry, and basically which he characterized it as, like Billington, a syncretistic religion, the remains of the Druids and the Magi of the Persia and Heliopolis of the Egypt and the priests of the sun. That Masonry is a sort of syncretic mystical tradition that is about sun worship. So just highlighting that. And then there's Thomas Paine. You can look more into it. Not exactly Christian friendly, was very against many of sort of a literal biblical framework for Christianity. And then we have Bolshevism. And we know that, if you go look up Putin, Bolshevism, so mean man in Russia has highlighted that the Soviet government was mostly of a particular orientation. We can find this in Bolshevism, which is really just a historical fact. But I only bring this up because somebody like Leon Trotsky, as well as Lenin, as well as Marx, we see a particular connection right here, and just highlighting that connection exists. And the atheistic movements of Europe are again syncretic within this whole thing. This what neoconservatism was, just to highlight that Trotsky. Again, we see Irving Kristol. Where is that? Irving Kristol, and that many were. Here, let me trot. Yeah, there we go. So, former Trotskyite theorists who developed a strong feeling of antipathy towards the New Left had numerous devotees, and that the neoconservative party was really the Social Democrats USA, and that they were just really created from Trotskyite ideals and followers. Again, Irving Kristol being one of those people that were a follower of Trotsky. And that's partly parcel why our government itself really has no opposition to the progressive agenda, which is the basis behind all this occultism, this esoteric spirituality, and the socialist communist ideals. Now, we talked about a little bit about the death of the Romanov family, and you can read more about it. But one of the things that are really interesting, of course, is this gentleman here, Yakov Yurovsky. He also he was actually part and parcel of the killing of the family, and he was known as the chief executioner of the Emperor Nicholas II of Russia and his family. And I highlighted something that I ended up finding after the stream. And if you come down here to the disposal section where it's talking about disposal of the bodies, let me see, where is that? Disposal. Here it is. You'll see that, and this is what I highlighted, that a few of Ermakov's men pawned the female bodies for diamonds. Now, this is after they've killed Alexander and his entire family. The female bodies for diamonds because they were hiding jewels. They thought they were getting ready to flee Russia before they were murdered. And their undergarments, two of the men lifted up Alexandria's skirt, the wife of Emperor Nicholas, and fingered her genitals. So very interesting. Now, Yurovsky again ordered them at gunpoint to back off, dismissing the two who had groped the Tsarnia's corpse and any others he had caught looting. So again, not an ideal situation, but I just wanted to connect all that together. And how Vilnius, the capital city of Lithuania, interestingly enough, again, with contemporary sources comparing it to Babylon, before World War II, it was considered the most important Jewish center of Europe and Jewish influence, that the nickname, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Even Napoleon called it the Jerusalem of the North. And so I highlight this because when you do this research, you could, again, if you're using this document, this book, you can do a word search for it. And you'll see that Vilnius is a city that comes up over and over and over in regards to some of the communist work and where they were meeting and where they were festering their ideas. So I just wanted to highlight that. This is the time outline of Russia, just to cover again how we lead up into the Bolshevik Revolution. And then, as I highlighted, again, looking at the Masonic connection with the Russian Revolution, as Orthodox Centurion, who sponsored the stream, asked me to do, I noted that within the Russian context, again, multiple conflating arguments there. Some show that it appeared to be that the Russian Masonic lodges were very much in favor of Tsar Nicholas, and that they were not pro-Bolshevism. However, there is an interesting connection I found in this article, which tied in the British connection, that British Freemasonry and British powers may had had a sort of Masonic conspiracy in which they funded some of the Bolsheviks, like Lenin and through German gold. So if you want to check that connection out, again, you can do so with this article at rbth.com. And if you do just a search for it, you should find it. And so with all that being said, I just wanted to create this video to sort of provide an overview of what the narrative was for that stream, and to show that I think what's so interesting is that these mixtures of the Masonic lodges, the French revolutionary spirit, socialist ideals, communism, illuministic spirituality, the practice of Kabbalah and magic, sort of all facilitate each other and move together in regards to these revolutions we see in continental Europe in the 19th century, marking a distinction between the Masonic influence in places of Protestant dominated religion, America, Britain, and the Scandinavian countries, along with Switzerland, even though Geneva was a hotspot for facilitation and meetings of many of these people. So I hope this provides a capstone and a full overview of what exactly was going on and what exactly I was trying to argue in that stream. So again, just want to thank you all. If you support my work, please become a website member, send in super chats, become a YouTube member, purchase a one-on-one, sponsor a stream. I'd be very appreciative. And I want to thank again Orthodox Centurion for sponsoring that stream last night. And as always, until next time, God bless.